In the 1950s, Vietnam meant almost nothing to most Americans. A distant country in Southeast Asia. Dense jungles. Poor villages. And a people emerging from decades of colonialism and war. But behind this small nation, the Cold War was reshaping the entire world. After the Second World War, the planet had been divided between two superpowers: the United States and the Soviet Union. And inside Washington, the greatest fear was not Vietnam itself, but communism. American leaders believed in what became known as the domino theory. The idea that if one country fell to communism, neighboring nations would collapse one after another like dominoes. So when Vietnam was divided into a communist North led by Ho Chi Minh and an American-backed South, the United States slowly began to intervene. At first, the involvement seemed limited. Military advisors, weapons, money. But little by little, America began sinking into a war it did not fully understand. Inside the Vietnamese jungles, there were no clear front lines. The enemy did not always wear uniforms, and combat could erupt at any moment from anywhere. A farmer carrying rice during the day might become a Viet Cong fighter at night. And this was where the psychological war truly began. American soldiers arrived expecting conventional battles. Instead, they entered a completely different world. Thick jungle that hid everything. Underground tunnel systems. Deadly booby traps. And an enemy that was almost invisible. Sometimes soldiers marched for hours through the jungle without seeing a single fighter. And then suddenly everything exploded around them. Gunfire from the trees. Mines beneath their feet. Screams inside, smoke, mud, heat, and chaos. Many veterans later described Vietnam as a constant state of fear. Not fear of what they could see, but fear of what they couldn't. Some soldiers stopped sleeping normally. Others became suspicious of everyone around them. Even women and children inside villages became sources of anxiety. As the war escalated during the 1960s, America sent hundreds of thousands of troops into Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson feared that losing Vietnam would make the United States appear weak before the world. But the more troops arrived, the more chaotic the war became. In Washington, officials spoke endlessly about progress. Inside Vietnam, soldiers experienced something completely different. Burning villages, bodies in the mud, friends dying without warning, patrols disappearing inside the jungle. The war slowly began destroying soldiers psychologically. Some turned to drugs. Others became emotionally numb. Many simply focused on surviving long enough to go home. But the catastrophe did not remain inside Vietnam. Because for the first time in modern history, war entered people's homes through television. Every night Americans watched images from the jungle. Dead soldiers. Villages burning under napalm. Terrified civilians running through smoke. One photograph in particular shocked the world. A young girl running naked after a napalm attack, screaming in pain. Suddenly, the image of a heroic and glorious war began collapsing inside America itself. And across the country, protests exploded. Students marched through the streets. Musicians condemned the war. Journalists began questioning the government openly. And millions of Americans started asking the same dangerous question. Why are we even there? Then came 1968. The year that shattered the illusion completely. During the Tet Offensive, Communist forces launched massive coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Even cities believed to be secure suddenly became battlefields. Militarily, the offensive was costly for the Viet Cong. But psychologically, it was devastating for America. Because the government had spent years claiming the enemy was close to collapse. And yet suddenly, Americans were watching enemy fighters attack major cities on live television. Trust began to collapse. If America was winning, how could this happen? Even respected news anchors began changing their tone. The war no longer looked like victory. It looked like a bloody endless trap. And inside the military itself, psychological exhaustion spread rapidly. Soldiers returned home carrying nightmares, addiction, rage, and guilt. Many could no longer reconnect with ordinary life. Some woke up screaming in the middle of the night. Others panicked at the sound of fireworks or helicopters. Today, this would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. But at the time, very few people understood what these men were experiencing. Then another horror emerged. The My Lai massacre. In 1968, American soldiers entered the Vietnamese village of My Lai during a military operation. What happened there became one of the darkest chapters of the war. Unarmed civilians were killed. Women, children, elderly villagers. When details of the massacre reached the American public, outrage exploded across the country. How had a war supposedly fought for freedom turned into this? The protests grew larger and angrier. Even veterans themselves began speaking publicly about the horrors they had witnessed. And while protests intensified inside America, the war inside Vietnam became even more brutal. By the early 1970s, belief in the war was collapsing completely. Many soldiers no longer cared about victory. Their only goal was survival. But even returning home did not mean escape. Thousands of veterans carried the war back with them. The fear, the guilt, the memories. Some spent years battling addiction. Others isolated themselves from society. Many felt abandoned by the country they had fought for. Meanwhile, inside Vietnam, communist forces continued advancing. Despite overwhelming military power, the United States could not fully control the terrain or break the enemy's determination. The jungle seemed to swallow armies whole. And eventually, America began withdrawing. Then came 1975. The fall of Saigon. One of the most iconic and humiliating scenes in modern American history. Helicopters lifted people from rooftops. Crowds pushed desperately toward the American embassy. Officials destroyed documents while civilians begged for evacuation. The entire world watched the collapse unfold in real time. The war America had entered with enormous confidence ended in chaos and retreat. More than 58,000 American soldiers had died. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and fighters were killed or displaced. But perhaps the deepest wound was psychological. Vietnam shattered the image of America as an unbeatable power. It shattered public trust in government. And it left an entire generation haunted by memories they could never fully escape. Even decades later, Vietnam continued shaping American culture. Films stopped portraying war as glorious heroism. Instead, war became madness, fear, psychological collapse. Stories from Vietnam transformed the way America viewed conflict forever. Because Vietnam was not just a military defeat. It became a warning. A warning about political arrogance. About endless wars. About what happens when immense power enters a conflict it does not truly understand. And even today, the images remain burned into memory. Helicopters above endless jungle. Exhausted soldiers staring silently into the trees. Children fleeing through smoke and fire. And in Washington stands the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. A long black wall carrying the names of more than 58,000 dead Americans. People visit it in silence. Some touch the engraved names softly. Others cry while seeing their own reflections in the dark stone. Because Vietnam was never just a war between nations. It was a war that changed the way America saw itself. And perhaps that is why the question still lingers after all these decades. How could the most powerful nation on earth enter a distant jungle with absolute confidence and leave without even understanding when it began losing itself?